Okay, we can see your screen, Dr. Unschuld.
Yeah.
Okay, about 5 more minutes, so.
Okay, shall I leave it as is now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good.
All right.
The participants see my screen. They don't see me. Is that right?
Professor, just so you know, I think that I can see you in a small window. So we'll mostly see your screen during this recording, but we'll see you probably in a small window.
All the participants or only
Yes,
the discussants?
I believe so, yeah. Everyone right now. We have, besides ourselves, we may have like 8 other people who can see you in a small window right now.
Okay. As you see, it's still sunny outside. This is why my the left side of my face is still lit by the sun.
Yes, it is. Is it late afternoon there?
Yeah, for almost 5 p.m.
Ah. So hopefully it's your good side on the left.
Yeah, perfect.
Professor, just in the minute or two before we get started, I'll mention Daniel Schreier is on at the moment, and he's here in place of Zev Rosenberg. He's the editor for Zev Rosenberg's books.
I see a couple of names: Dan Schreier, Greg Johnson, Ingrid Schneider, Jasmine Oberste, Joseph Maria. Haven't had the pleasure of meeting any one of them so far.
Yep. And again, in 1 or 2 minutes before, Jasmine Oberst says that she's coming here from West Coast Canada, British Columbia, and she saw this on a Chinese medicine publishing Facebook page.
Good, good, good. Then let me set an alarm for 10:45.
Well, we looks like we have 1 minute.
Good.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome. This is Ellen Teeter. I'm the executive director of the Florida State Oriental Medical Association, and we are very proud to be sponsoring this event. Dr. Unschuld is a scholar and translator of classical Chinese, and this book to me is one of the most important translations to come out in quite a while. The Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù was first, I believe, back in the 15th century, published, and has the complete compendium of herbs known at that time. Many of these we don't know now, so this could add great amounts of information to our medicine. We have a sponsor, Far East Summit. They have the books, as you also have some coupons to save money on some of the books on the Net of Knowledge site. Far East Summit's existence is to alleviate pain and disease. They want to cultivate and improve life. And they have a refined herbal products of all sorts and lots of educational material on their website. I'll make sure you have that link before you leave. Just for a second, if you want to ask questions, we're going to put them in the Q&A box, which is 2 bubbles with Q and A under it. If you want to just chat with each other, that's what the chat box is for. I will try to check both for questions, and we'll ask questions and answers at the end after the presentation. First, I want to introduce Andy Pham for a minute. He is actually how I connected with Dr. Unschuld, and he has some words to say. Andy?
Ellen, thank you very much. I would try to keep this brief. Yes, everything Ellen said is true. Far East Summit is the sponsor of today's webinar. Very briefly, they're the exclusive manufacturer of the Chinese classics, liquid extracts and liquid concentrates line. That's originally by Jake Fratkin. We also have, as Ellen said, the 6 volumes that are newly published by Professor Unschuld. We also have one of his small paperback books that I think some of you may not be aware of, but I think all of you may find it quite intriguing. It's called Traditional Chinese Medicine, Heritage and Adaptation. It's a very short readable book, quite affordable, but I think it says some things in there that are quite, shall we say, controversial, but still intriguing to anyone who practices in the field. That might be a good starting point for those of you who either have not looked at Professor Unschuld's other books or may not have heard about it. It's very recent and it is on our site. We have other classical books on there as well by other authors. So we encourage you to see that site. Look for the books page at fareastsummit.com. I would be remiss this morning if I didn't say very briefly that this is the anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. For families like myself who are primarily here in the US, quite frankly, as a result of that war, today is always kind of a meaningful day, somewhat poignant, perhaps sad and reflectful. I've been attending national meetings, regional meetings, and even local events on the Vietnam War this month leading up to today. So I want to say briefly that today will be a day that I think about what brought people like myself and my family and many others to this country here in the US. But for the next hour, all of us will be able to appreciate what Professor Unschuld has recently published, and I've been following him for probably no less than 2 decades in terms of his publications in English. I think perhaps some of you on today's webinar have been following him for maybe as long and maybe even twice as long. His publications in English published here in this country go back now over 4 decades. So I think many of you know about his Su Wen, about his Nanjing, about his Ling Shu. All of those are, you know, I think very relevant clinically to many of you. I'm sure you agree. What you may not be as familiar with, though, are the multi-volume series that he has published with his co-lexicographers, his co-editors. I'm referring to the Dictionary of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. That's another series that preceded the one you'll hear about today. But the difference here is that Professor Unschuld has had many co-editors working with him on those previous series. And somehow, I'm still not sure totally how, but he's been able to now produce 6 volumes of direct translation of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù itself. And to give you a sense of how voluminous this is, Li Shizhen himself, hundreds of years ago, produced most of this through his own efforts, but also with a lot of help from his own family. Professor Unschuld is producing this English translation primarily on his own. So not only would it be very unrealistic for any of us to think that we could publish 1,000 pages in a single year, but Professor Unschuld this year with the 3 volumes and last year with 3 other volumes is essentially producing 3,000 pages of translation in a single year. It is really Herculean, his effort. And I won't say much more, but hopefully for the next hour, we'll get a preview of perhaps these 3 volumes this year and 3 volumes last year. Professor Unschuld, thank you very much again for agreeing to be on with us today.
Is this then for me to take over?
Yes,
Please go right
yes.
ahead.
Okay, wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to present here. Yeah, basically an introduction to the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. First of all, I would like to tie up with what Andy Pham said about the end of the Vietnam War, because we just learned today that Putin, president of the Russian Federation, has said that it takes 106 seconds for his rockets to end up here in Berlin. And every day I can see on my way to my institute hundreds of refugees from Ukraine. So one war has ended a couple of decades ago and another is just beginning. That's the dire side of the present. Okay, but today we talk about the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. And let me see whether I can. Yeah, the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù is, I think the apex, the literary apex of the development of Chinese pharmaceutical wisdom. I should like to say wisdom, because the more I translate this work and the longer I deal with Chinese pharmaceutical knowledge, I really understand that this is a wisdom, and a wisdom that is not sufficiently shared by the entire world community of people interested in how to use natural products, especially plants, for therapeutic ends. And of course, it is a tradition that has been alive and lively for the past 2,000 or more years. We know very little about Chinese pharmaceutical practice and knowledge prior to the 2nd or 3rd centuries BC. But of course, as you see here on a market, it is very lively and still very much alive. And actually, yesterday and the day before yesterday, I was asked by a TV program, The Voice of Germany, which is same or equivalent to Voice of America and broadcasts to China. And they asked me about the significance of Lianhua Qingwen capsules for the treatment of COVID. So it's something that is not, a matter of the past, but it's something that is very much today up to date, and the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù needs to be taken into regard if one talks about Chinese pharmaceuticals. As we all know, pharmaceutical drugs have been described for 2,000 years in an ever more encompassing literature. The oldest finds date from about 200 BCE, with the Wuxi Erbi Fang offering knowledge on recipes for 52 diseases based on about 250 substances. And in this long history of Chinese material medical literature, there are a couple of I mean, there are many important works, but maybe 3 are outstanding, because the first one, focusing on single substances, is the Shennong Benzhao of probably the 2nd century CE. Next one is the first Materia Medica book written on request of the government, 7th century, the Xinshu Benzhao with 850 entries, and eventually then the apex is the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù with approximately 1,892 substances. And because of my background in pharmaceutical sciences, many decades ago in the 1970s, when I went to Taiwan to add modern Chinese to my classical Chinese training, I became interested, and I was led by a Chinese historian of medicine and pharmaceutical science, Professor Na Qi. I began to study Běn Cǎo literature. Běn Cǎo, of course, is the name of Chinese Materia Medica literature. And I analyzed about 110 or a few more Běn Cǎo works, from the Shennong Benzhao to the pharmacopoeia of the Chinese Republic in the 1930s. And of course, I was most impressed by the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. A quick view on the biography of the known author of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù, Li Shizhen, who lived from 1518 to 1593 in Qizhou, Hubei. A couple of years ago, in 2018, that's already 4 years ago, the Chinese held a big honoring ceremony in Qizhou, and they opened a fantastic museum to memorize Li Shizhen. And he was a man who had a grandfather who was an itinerant physician. Itinerant physicians exist in China to this very day. They are the very lowest and mostly despised class of practical healers in China. And obviously his grandfather, a Lingyi, which means physician walking with a bell through the streets and calling for customers, obviously had made enough money so that his son, Li Shizhen's father, Li Yanwen, could open a stationary clinic and practiced as a learned physician, was also an author. Some of his books are still known. And Li Shizhen then should kind of rise to the upper echelon of Chinese society. That is, she was supposed to become a civil servant. And this is why he went through this very, very hard training. And at the age of 14, he passed the first official exam, earned the title of Xiuzai, special talent, but he failed all following exams. And then, of course, had no choice, but was again on the way to become a physician, became an apprentice of his father. And we don't really know what happened over the next decades. There was a brief visit to Beijing, from where he returned to Qizhou in 1561. And then he began his work on the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. We do not know the size of his team. He mentions that some family members helped him. But if you look at the sheer size of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù, with its more than 1.6 million characters and the many books read, and the many travel and trips he made to different parts of the country, it's in a way it's unbelievable how within a couple of decades this huge work could be compiled and came into being. I presume, from having translated the entire work now, that he must have had a team, and many members of this team appear to have worked on their own. which you see from different quoting styles, etc. I can't go into detail of this here. So for 30 years, he worked on the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù with a team of unknown size. And in 1578, that is 15 years before the publication finally resulted, he began to search for a printer. Obviously, he was turned back everywhere until eventually he met a person who was very much impressed and wrote a preface to the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù, accepted it, and the same year it was published. Li Shizhen died, that is in 1593. His son Li Jianyuan presented the manuscript to the emperor. It was not the best edition. The next edition from 1601 was better because of the illustrations. Okay, to this day, Li Shizhen is known to virtually everyone with the lowest grade school education. Li Shizhen appears in TV shows. Li Shizhen is honored in TV series. Li Shizhen is honored in child books. And I mean, even my children, I told them, if your future does not touch on China any longer, once you've left your father's home, but two persons from Chinese medical history you should remember forever, and they do actually. And one is Sun Tzu Miao, the physician of the Tang dynasty, and the other, of course, is Li Shizhen. 1593, the first printed edition in China called Jinling edition. And in 1603, excuse me, not 1601, 1603, the Jiangxi edition with new illustrations was immediately exported to Japan, where in 1637, a first reprint in Tokyo appeared. And actually in 1702, a first copy reached in Berlin. It is today here in the National Library. And my wife and I recently sponsored a renovation of this opening. A couple of years ago, I was asked by the Chinese authorities to apply to the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization to have the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù accepted or listed in the memory of the World International Register. I did so, and this was approved. And we can say now Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù is inscribed in the memory of the world, but it is not accessible to the world. And the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù is not only a collection of pharmaceutical therapeutic advice still valid today, it is also a museum of many thoughts and achievements in the history of Chinese science and civilization. But how open are the doors of this museum with its contents having been acknowledged now as part of the memory of the world? There's a Japanese edition, and I've used it. It has been quite helpful because the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù is, of course, for the most part, maybe 90%, I don't know, consists of quotes from literary sources of previous 1,600 years. And these quotes often contain kind of secondary quotes. That is, an author of the 11th century is quoted, and in his quote, he quotes an author from the 2nd century. And the Chinese text does not show where this secondary quote begins and where it ends. And this is where the Japanese translation helped me a lot, because the Japanese translators and editors had taken great pains to identify all these secondary quotes, and that has helped me. And also, of course, the Japanese language for a German is, or maybe also for American or native English speakers, is helpful, because sometimes you see a couple of Chinese characters and you do not know, do they belong together? Is that a binomial, or is this kind of one dependent on the other? And then I go to the Japanese edition because there they have all the grammatical kind of these Japanese signs noting a genitive or accusative or verbal ending, etc., and that helps too. So, but still, it has, as I said, very few explanatory notes and is not really helpful to people outside of East Asia. And then, of course, there is this English edition about 30 or more years ago, made by Li Shizhen and published by Foreign Language Press. Li Shizhen, his English, I guess, was much better than my English is, but his deficits are he knew neither European or Western medical history or medicine, and he didn't know anything about Chinese medical history, and he did what the French call traduire à kilomètre, that is just word for word. And his translation is totally inadequate to globally promote the significance of Li Shizhen and his Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. I'm not out here to badmouth Li Shizhen and his product, but if this weren't as it is, I would not have been willing to spend more than 1/10 of my life on preparing a first serious and adequate translation of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. The deficiencies, or the major deficiencies of Li Shizhen's version are inadequate annotations, place names, book titles, identification of persons. I mean, in a Materia Medica book with quotes from the past 2000 years, of course, there are very many place names. But as most of you will know, in China during the imperial era, place names were changed every couple of decades. And when you read something about the origin of a plant or the origin of a case history, etc., you want to know, where did this happen and where did it originate from? And you have to do lots of research and go into many dictionaries and historical sources to find out where all these place names are, because most of them are no longer known today. The same is true with book titles. Li Shizhen quotes more than 1,000 book titles and books, and the titles, many of them are lost or are quoted in abbreviated versions. And of course, you want to know, where did this quote come from? And by just opening the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù and looking at a title, you do not know. Same is true for persons. Li Shizhen and his team quote many individuals as authors, as patients, or as sources of knowledge, as people who belong to a certain religion, had dreams or whatever. And many of them are not known any longer. And as I'll say in a minute, and as Andy already pointed out, to identify place names, book titles, and persons, and also disease names, we prepared 3 dictionaries, which I'll explain in a minute. So another deficiency of Li Shizhen's translation is a misleading translation of disease terms and therapeutic indications. This translation was done 30 or 40 years ago, when most people in China and many also in non-Chinese countries believed that Chinese medicine will gain a kind of a good image and will be accepted by the community of healers and also academic and scientific healers if all the disease terms are immediately translated by means of modern biomedical disease terms and indications. And that, of course, occasionally fits, but often enough it borders on the absurd. For instance, when Li Shizhen often enough speaks of what literally would be demons, or so as kind of viruses, etc. That fits nicely, but it is simply ahistorical. Then there are many text passages which Li Shizhen might have thought to be too absurd or not fitting modern times. They were simply omitted, and then more difficult passages where you really need classical Chinese and have to go back into the Shijing, etc., and other classical works to understand them. They were mistranslated, and the Shijing, the Book of Songs, is a good example, because often enough you find quotes in the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù saying Shi Yue, which Li Shizhen translated as a song goes. No, it's the Shijing says, and to understand that short quote, you have to go into the Shijing and then quote the entire original source to understand that abbreviated. So this English version of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù, which has been exported to the whole world, is as if China were to export flawed silk or flawed jade or stained silk. And it's certainly not worth of such a great contribution by Chinese naturalists to world knowledge. So come back to the dictionaries. When I decided to, to begin with the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù translation, I thought I first have to publish 3 or 4 dictionaries, because all these disease names and place names and book titles, etc., there are so many that you cannot add notes at the end of each page in a later translation. So Volkswagen Foundation in Germany allowed me to kind of hire or engage 3 Chinese experts, the best you could find, I should think, to help me. As Andy pointed out, these were Professor Zheng Jinsheng from Beijing, who is probably the best expert on historical materia medica literature, is the has the highest government kind of honored academic position you can imagine in China. Then there's Professor Zhang Zhibin, a wonderful person who is the expert in the history of diseases. And then there's Professor Hualin Fu from the Renda, the People's University in Beijing. And he is the expert for geographical history of China. And they really, without them, this dictionary would never have been possible. And the 3 of them supplied me with knowledge. Professor Zheng Jinsheng on book titles and person identification. Professor Zhang Zhibin provided me with the knowledge of the disease terms, and Hualin Fu with knowledge on for an identification on all of all the place names. And it was based on these Chinese data which they provided to me, and they came here to Berlin, and first to Munich and then to Berlin to stay with us. And without them, these 3 dictionaries would never have been possible. And of course, these dictionaries are useful for anybody who works with ancient Chinese sources, because no matter whether you go into novels or Jinping Mei or The Dream of the Red Chamber, you often enough encounter illness terms, and definitely in normal or the usual dictionaries of classical Chinese, you do not find an adequate translation. So here was the first volume which we made, Chinese Historical Illness Terminology, and I did this together with Zhang Zhibin and myself, and that appeared with University of California Press in 2015. And I'm of course eternally glad to University of California Press, because very few people purchase these volumes because very few people think they are of use to them, and still UC Press has published them. The second volume was, oh yeah, that's wrong, excuse me, look at the title, Geographical and Administrative Designations with Hualin Fu, and I had Paul Buell from Washington. He also came to Berlin and helped me. That appeared in 2017, and then volume 3, authors and book titles, where Nalini Kirk, Paul Buell, and Jung Jincheng assisted me. And it was on the basis of these 3 volumes that eventually I could start to translate the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. And as Andy said, I had to do this just all alone. I've written every single page and I've translated every single character all by myself, because this has to come out of one hand. Otherwise, you would not have the impression that is one whole. And so the task was to prepare an adequate English translation of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù based on serious philological and historiographic methods. And that was the target. Philological and historiographic methods, as they have been elaborated in our translations of ancient Greek, ancient Arabic, ancient Latin classics. And here now, for the first time, these methods are applied to a translation of the most important work ever published in China, and one must say on the entire Eurasian continent, in regard to the application of natural and man-made substances to cure or prevent human illness. And so this was meant to globally promote the contribution of Li Shizhen to world knowledge. And then, of course, also, and that's quite important, and this is why you have joined this webinar, to enable TCM practitioners outside of China to enter the world of Chinese medicine without an intermediary. Because, I mean, I have around me very, very many books written in English, in French, in Italian, in Russian, in German. Actually, the very first book on Chinese medicine I ever read was in Russian. And of course, these books are very important and they're very helpful, but they all present kind of Chinese medical knowledge and pharmaceutical wisdom as if through a sieve, and of course stained by modern views, by modern expectations, by modern knowledge also. And here, for the first time, with this translation of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù, you have direct access. And I mean, before I began this translation, I knew, of course, otherwise I wouldn't have done it, that this is an extremely important book. But now that I've completed translation a couple of weeks ago, I realize how genius is, and I mean how ingenious it is, and how much knowledge you can gain from it. Let us briefly take a look at the complete series that is to be published by University of California Press. A couple of volumes have appeared already, like Waters, Fire, Salts, Metal Jades, and Mountain Herbs, Marshland Herbs, Creeping Herbs, Vegetables, Fruits, Woods, Clothes, Fowls. And all these volumes, UC Press agreed to publish as individual separate units. That is, you do not have to purchase the entire series in order to get an understanding of what these volumes are and what the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù is. Every volume has its own introduction. Every volume has its own indices. And if you are interested only in mountain herbs or fragrant herbs, okay, you may wish to purchase volume 3. If you're interested in vegetables and fruits, you purchase volume 6. Or if you're interested in fowls, domestic and wild animals, or human substances, published volume 9. And of course, here you also see the volumes of the dictionary. 3 volumes have been published. We are working on a 1st volume, but that's my wife and Professor Zheng Jincheng. They work on a 4th dictionary volume, that is substance identification, and maybe that will also appear sometime in the future. So this is, if you were to look behind me, what you would see. In my back, you see the 3 dictionary volumes that have appeared already, and the 6 volumes of my translation that have been shipped to Berlin by UC Press. The Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù is a fascinating encyclopedia, unparalleled in contents and structure in pre-19th century Europe. It covers a wide range and utilizes a wide range of sources, and that's truly impressive. I mean, there's no arrogance that shines through the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù, in that maybe we quote only learned authors with an accepted academic background, or no, knowledge of convicts, beggars, professional healers, civil servants, and emperors is fed into the work, and the written records there is oral information collected all over the country, dreams, everything feeds into the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. And what is new for materia medica work in China, there are numerous case histories to kind of show the application, and mostly successful application, of certain substances in actual case histories. And there is a chronological discussion of the nature of substances and their effects in every monograph. That is, you have a substance, an herb, a tree, a vegetable, or whatever, and Li Shizhen offers a chronological discussion of the nature of substances and their effects. That is, he quotes the very first author, and then the next author, and then the next author, and eventually says, okay, let me sum up. He is right, I agree with him, I do not agree with him, etc., etc. And that's unique. And that's what makes it so helpful to anybody who really wants to enter kind of Chinese phytotherapy, because by reading through these kind of lists of opinions, you really get a feeling for a certain substance, because these were not kind of naive people. These were learned observers of, you know, what a substance can do to a human organism, and they wrote it down. And over the centuries, of course, impressions changed and views changed. That is unique, and that makes it so rich, and that makes it so different from modern writings, as important they are on Chinese materia medica. And there are, of course, many detailed specifics on human morphology and physiology, and countless cultural data. My co-worker on the dictionaries, Professor Zheng Jincheng, who is the preeminent Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù expert of present-day China, has characterized it in this way. Some of the pharmaceutical substances gathered in this book had already left the platform of their clinical application. However, the data associated with them offer abundant material to study the customs of the people and the culture of the past. While he gathered data related to pharmaceutical substances, Li Shizhen never hesitated to extend his investigations and collection to all possible realms. That is why the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù appears to be a book on materia medica. It is in fact an encyclopedia of natural science, and has become a treasure house for today's researchers of many fields of science. Now let's take a look at the contents. These are 52 chapters plus 2 chapters of illustrations. The text quotes 800 earlier persons, more than 800, around 1,892 monographs of pharmaceutically used substances, and describes 374 substances for the first time, with 1,109 illustrations, and added are 8,160 recipes. This is also new. for Materia Medica books in China, that for each substance you have many, many recipes added. Chapters 1 to 4, these are the final ones in my translation. I only recently completed this, the translation of chapters 1 through 4. I did chapters 5 through 52 first and put these to the end for very good reason. This is introductory information. He gives all the sources. There is a general introduction with therapy and diagnosis. And here you really have kind of direct access. This is what I meant earlier, direct access without an intermediary to an understanding of a really knowledgeable person, as Li Shizhen was, on how to use pharmaceutical substances for therapeutic ends. And this is so lively, and it is as if he stood next to me and told me this is how Chinese traditional pharmaceutics work. And very, very impressive. Of course, there's also theoretical advice offered by earlier authors, especially those from the Sung Jin Yuan era, pharmaceutical processing of drugs, on collecting pharmaceutical substances, substances most suited for certain diseases, and abbreviated recipes as memory aids. And that's truly amazing. I have put together here, let me see, how do we come with time? Oh, wow. Materia Medica works of all authors through the ages. Yeah. List of medical experts of all times quoted. List of classical and historiographic books. Complete enumeration of pharmaceutical drugs taken over from the earlier Běn Cǎo works, etc. And you see, here's just one example. He quotes Cao Gang Mu. Cao Gang Mu said, that is a Sung author, oftentimes when people use ancient recipes today, they are not effective. He said so in Sung Dynasty times. Why? They're not familiar with the meaning of ancient advice. For example, Zhang Zhongjing, in his treatments of chest blockage with an obstacle illness hardening the heart and counterflow battling the heart, used the decoction to cure or govern the center. The 4-item ginseng, atractylodes, dry ginger, and glycyrrhizol, together weighing 12 liang, were boiled in 8 chung of water down to 3 chung. When this recipe was prepared to pills, they had the size of an egg yolk. This recipe always proved to be of exceptional effect. Today, people ingest 1 pill about the size of red bayberries, and when the disease is not eliminated, they say the pharmaceutical drugs are not divine. But this is not the fault of pharmaceutical drugs. It is the fault of those who use pharmaceutical drugs. You see, such discussions are extremely helpful, and you get the idea, at least when I translate this, as if I were part of a discussion that could have happened even today. Or whenever pharmaceuticals are passed through a sieve to prepare a powder for pills, use a fine mesh, tough silk sieve. When the sieving is completed, put the powder into a mortar and pound it several hundred times until the color and the size of the grains are even. Then it is an excellent powder. All fat and greasy pharmaceutical drugs such as croton seeds, apricot kernels, and sesame seeds are first simmered until they turn yellow, and then they are pounded together into a paste. Rub the paste with your fingers to test whether the ingredients are perfectly mixed, that is, are gone, and add more powder in small amounts. Grind all ingredients together into powder fine enough to pass through a light, wide mesh silk sieve, then combine them again and pound them to obtain an even mixture that can be passed through a fine mesh sieve. Oops, my alarm says at 45 minutes. Okay, and so you have all kinds of advice. I will not go into detail here on this. And then there come these more, detailed advice on 7 types of recipes of preparation, the tea and flavor, required and prohibited combinations of the 5 flavors, one-sided superiority of the 5 flavors. All these things are, all this is knowledge you want to know when you deal with traditional Chinese pharmaceutical substances. I will not go into more detail here, just give you another overview of the very, very many points in these chapters. This is still chapter 1, yeah, and advice on the application of conduit guiding substances, supplementing and draining effects of the 5 flavors in the 5 long-term depots, etc., etc. So different pharmaceutical drugs sharing the same name, pharmaceutical drugs that should be avoided during pregnancy. And then, of course, you have kind of pharmaceutical drugs that should be avoided in combination with certain beverages and food, for instance, pork. Yeah. So chapter 3 and 4 offer lists of recipes for hundreds of diseases and illness signs. And these recipes are often given in extremely abbreviated statements and follow a detailed categorization according to classification of the main ingredients. And here you see, this is for practitioners, all types of wind intrusion, medication blown into the nose, vapors to steam, fumigate the nose. And this goes on. And then spasms wind intrusion with a presence of cold chi, wind intrusion with a presence of moisture, etc., etc. Stiff neck, and always subheadings affected by wind intrusion, moisture, peak illness, epilepsy, to induce spitting up of phlegm, etc. Very, very detailed. And the interesting thing is that you have sometimes subdivisions, cures applied internally, cures from the outside, or cures applied internally. This is so detailed. I rush through this, and here you see what I meant by abbreviated recipes. For instance, aye, common mugwort leaves, all of you know. Then it briefly says to cauterize all types of windstroke with lockjaw. This seems to be simply kind of appealing to your memory, because you know in the full text in chapter 15:05:01, you have this recipe in full detail. Clenched jaw resulting from windstroke, apply cauterization with prepared mugwort leaves 5 times each on 1 chengjiang needle insertion hole and on 2 jiache holes. That is, all these hundreds of recipes in chapter 3 and 4 seem to be abbreviated, shortened versions of very lengthy and detailed recipes. Here's another example for epilepsy of children. Soak in wine 5 scorpions, pound them with pomegranate into a pulpy mass, calcine it, grind it into powder, and let the patient ingest with milk 5 Pfund. This is also just an abbreviation of a very long recipe later on. So in the following chapters, then you have the individual substances. Begins with waters. I mean, how important are different waters to process natural substances? Fires, you cannot just fire, I mean, heat it over a fire, but there are many different types of firing, and all this is detailed here. Soils, metals. And then, of course, chapters 12 through 37 are the herbs, grains, cereals, vegetables, fruit, trees, very detailed. I rush through this just to show you or give you a very, very first impression of the wealth and of the richness of contents of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù. Chapter 38, tissues and tools, used, soil, decayed items, paper, etc. Most of this, of course, as Professor Jung said, has left the platform of pharmaceutically useful items, but it's interesting. And then chapter 39 through 42, insects, bugs, worms. Chapter 43 through 51, animals living in water, on land, equipped with scales, feathers, armors. 51, strange types, and 52 human substances, because of course humans were considered to be the higher. So a a final word on the structure of the monographs. You have, of course, a heading, like here, Glycyrrhiza oralensis, Chinese licorice, which all of you know in chapter 12. It gives the name, and then it says where it appears for the first time, FE, first evidence in the Benjing, and there it was called upper rank, that is non-poisonous, and so, and then you have explanations of names, which is very interesting because China is such a huge country and has such a long history, which means that in many parts of regions, you have different names for one and the same substance. And that, of course, is quite important when you read sources from different centuries and sources from different regions of China. So the explanations are named, and always, I mean, as if this were a modern scientific work, always Li Shizhen quotes the source where he got his knowledge from. And this is exceptional and has never been the case kind of before, and also there is no equal in Europe such. Yeah, this looks like very much, and obviously you will not be able to read this entire slide here, but I have put this text in here just to show you, for a simple substance, yeah, collected explanations, how Li Shizhen first quotes the Bielu, the very first Materia Medica work, then Tao Hongjing, the Taoist, then Su Sung, then himself. And often enough, between the first mentioning in the Bielu or Shenong Benjing or whatever, and himself, there are 4, 5, 6, or 10 different authors, and eventually he discusses all of them together. Okay, I guess pharmaceutical preparation, we will not go into detail of all the other items. I stop here because we have, I've spent 45 or more minutes on giving you a first impression, and maybe now you wish to ask a few questions and give me a chance or a few minutes to go into more detail in view of something you might wish to know more about. So I guess I stop here, and I hope that you will never look down on the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù again, but will look up to Li Shizhen and its team, because it's an amazing contribution to Chinese medicine, and I think to world medicine. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open up for some questions now. I have one. How does the dictionary series relate to the actual volumes of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù?
Yeah, okay. The Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù consists of quotes taken from, of course, oral informations of the time, 16th century, but for the most part, this is a collection of quotes taken from literary works of the previous 1,600, 1,800 years. And if we look at illness terms or disease terminology, the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù includes about 4,500 disease terms. And this does not include something like, painful leg or so, but real basic disease terms. And these basic disease terms, most of them are no longer understood even in China, and even less, of course, outside of China. And what we have done is Professor Zhang Zhibin has offered me and provided me with the data on the first appearance of an illness term in the 2nd century BC, in 8th CE, etc., what it must have meant at the time, what it meant in the 16th century when Li Shizhen quoted it, and what it might mean or how it could be interpreted today. So whenever you open any volume of the 9-volume translation of the Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù with all these recipes and descriptions of individual substances, all the time you will come across illness terms, and if they are not immediately understandable, like I do not use, and that of course is what I've never done, I do not use modern biomedical terms for illnesses. I try to be as strictly literal as possible. That has confronted me with much, how shall I say, polemics, because when you translate these ancient disease terms literally, they do not look modern scientific. But why should they? I mean, why should an author of the 8th century have used a modern biomedical term? They had their ways to express themselves, and they had their terminology, and there are very many images, there are very many metaphors that are simply metaphors and are not modern biomedical terms. And if they are kind of self-evident, and cough, of course, is evident, or outflow, which I use instead of diarrhea or dysentery, then you do not need an explanation. But if a substance is difficult to immediately understand, then I add a quote and I said, this means this, and look up Běn Cǎo Gāng Mù Dictionary, Volume 3, page 455. And of course, the same applies to persons or to book titles or to place names that if you hit or if you encounter a certain place name and you do not know where it is, and for the most part you have no way of knowing where it is, then of course I have not added a note, footnote, because that would have doubled the size of the volumes, but then you look it up in the dictionary. So unfortunately, if you are really interested in knowing where these places refer to, then you need to have the place name dictionary to the side of your translation of the monographs. The fact is, these volumes are around 1,000 pages each, 1,000 pages each. And that was a strict kind of upper limit UC Press set. And if I would have added even more notes, then this limit would have been exceeded. So the dictionaries helped me to translate, and they help future readers to understand the message.
Professor, I hope you'll pardon me for interrupting. I just want to get to a couple of questions here that I see in the Q&A. I want to ask this one right away because it's detailed, and I'd like maybe if you can say something briefly about Jasmine Oberst's questions from Canada, and then I'll bring up Greg Johnston because he has more broad general questions that I think, I don't know if there's an easy answer to what Greg is saying, but let's bring up Jasmine Oberst first. Very quickly, I'm talking quickly. I'm so grateful. Hi, I'm so grateful for your work in the field for Chinese medicine generally, and for this series specifically. I wonder if there is a comprehensive list for the whole series, ideally in pinyin, but Latin botanical okay too, that indicates which volume the herb is in. For example, if I want to look up Bai Ji and I don't know which volume it is in or what kind of plant it is.
Yeah, that's that should be volume 4 of the dictionary. That should be volume 4 of the dictionary.
And then within that volume, we can use the index at the back. Thank you.
Yeah.
In Canada.
I mean, every volume now has an index, and if you hit if you encounter an herbal name in one of the volumes, if it has a monograph in that very volume, then the index at the end says, okay, this volume, chapter 15, entry 23. if it has an entry in another volume, then it does not give this specific number. And this will be given in the final dictionary volume number 4, where all items are identified, because many items have names that may not have referred to the same substance 500 years ago, or 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. And we will kind of, and this is of course important because quite a few people are, I must say, naive enough to believe that when they take a recipe from the Shanghan Lun and they take the names of these items and go to a pharmacy shop and say, I would love to have this and this and that, the probability that they get the same substances that were meant by these names 1,500 or 600 years ago, probability is slim. And volume 4, which my wife does with Professor Zheng Jinsheng, will kind of
Dr. Unschuld, I believe you've frozen. Are you there? Am I there?
Ellen, hi, I can hear you okay, yeah. I think we
Okay.
have you, but I'm not sure if Professor, if we lost him momentarily.
Okay.
I appreciate, I saw what you said here in the chat, and I think that Greg Johnston, his questions are very broad in general. I was hoping that we could just push them, you know, to the end because they're kind of broad in general.
No, that chat was to you. I'm not sure what's going on. I think we lost Dr. Unschuld. What I'll do is send these questions to him and we'll get an answer, and I'll put them up in the Net of Knowledge as a handout. I've also asked him if I can put his PowerPoint up as a handout, if people are interested in that. But I think we've lost him now, so I will record the questions and we'll get them answered. But for now, I believe we need to end the webinar. So I want to thank you all for attending. Again, Dr. Unschuld is a leading scholar, and we are just so pleased and honored to have had him here speaking to us and telling us about this work. It's a huge undertaking and a hugely valuable thing for our profession to now have this in English. Everybody, thank you. We'll get a recording up on the Net of Knowledge site fairly soon. And thank you very much. Thank you, Andy. Talk to you later.
Okay, yeah, I guess we lost him. We lost him for sure for now, I guess.
Okay.
But luckily we made it to the end.
Yes.
I think we made it to the end with him and we didn't lose him.
Yeah, we're good. I think he had some internet problems, but all right. Thank you so much.